Over the last 500 million years, what started as a startle reflex transformed into emotion and now shapes the structure of policy itself. It's incredibly contagious, historically been weaponized as punishment, and even heritable under the right conditions. But after a millennium of influencing, well, everything, fear seems to be less pervasive than we once thought. In fact, fear is so modifiable that not only are more people seeking it out as a form of entertainment, but in a lab, fear can be erased far easier than it's learned. Just like everything else, eventually humanity found a way to conquer it. And conquer it, we did. Except, that's completely false. As of 2019, anxiety disorders have shot up by 55%, while new phobias pop up every other year, most of which seem irrational or harmless, yet are still potent enough to shape entire generations. Have we really found a way to conquer fear, or has it just mutated into different forms? Well, in a cycle as old as our species itself, no matter how many fears we overcome, twice as many emerge just as quickly to take their place, changing in form as humanity moved from real threats to abstract ones, evolving with us as fear moved from biology into culture, and then fiction, science, finance, technology, space exploration, and every other layer of human existence. It is possibly the one thing we may never be able to control. With an influence so deep, it's unsettling to imagine what control over fear would even look like. But despite everything I just said, there's a catch. We have found a way to dull fear's effects, and yet it's everywhere, spreading wider than ever before. Is fear getting stronger? If fear is getting stronger, how would we even know? One way is to look at individuals, using their heart rate and their flinches, but that's too one-dimensional and doesn't account for the diversity in fear. Another way would be to track different fears across society, but that's too static and only tells us where fear is right now. So a better method would be to start from the beginning, mapping as many different fears as we can through a series of levels, the deepest being biology. At the biological level, we have the most primitive fears, the oldest of which is the acoustic startle reflex, which isn't technically a fear, but is the foundation of every other fear. Its only purpose is survival, by forcing a reaction to any sudden noise. Because of that, it's an all-or-nothing response, hardwired into the brainstem and universal across all mammals. However, while this does mean that it can't scale in strength, it doesn't mean that it can't scale in sensitivity, and when paired with higher brain regions, this reflex could be shaped by perception, which is where the second fear in this level comes from, heights. The fear of heights is also hardwired, so much so that even turtles have it. But in humans, it's even more apparent, as in infants, the illusion of a drop-off causes them to pause and refuse to cross, which marks the beginning of what characterizes real fear. It's anticipatory. While the fear of heights is very narrow, recognizing cues in the environment came with its own set of advantages. Chief among them was anticipating threats instead of just reacting to them. And while this was undeniably beneficial, it did have one major drawback. Now, fear was something that lingered. An environment full of information that's very helpful. It allowed us to predict, anticipate, and respond preemptively. But strip away that information, and what once kept you safe starts to work against you. Or in other words, darkness, the last fear in this level. What's interesting about darkness, to me, is that it isn't the dark that makes things unsettling. In fact, many prey animals are nocturnal precisely because of the darkness. What makes the darkness unsettling is what it hides, a function of the fact that we're diurnal. Humans are overwhelmingly daylight dependent, so much so that the cones in our eyes require bright light to function well. At night, there is no bright light. So in response, we use another type of cell located in the periphery of the retina called rods. And while they're great at detecting motion, they are terrible at detecting detail, which leaves us in a position where we can't pick up on color, can't pick up on sharpness, but are hypersensitive to the jittery shapes at the edge of our vision. By itself, this isn't too bad, but imagine living 300,000 years ago, where real-life monsters much stronger than you or I were actively hunting humans. Suddenly, every rustle could be a predator, every shadow, a threat. Which gets to the heart of what makes the darkness terrifying. You can never be certain, and when your main survival strategy is anticipating threats, this same system is now working in overdrive, constantly guessing off of very limited information what's dangerous and what's not. Over generations, those who guess danger more often survive longer, and as a result, changed fear forever. Now, it persists, it can spread, but most importantly, it thrives under ambiguity. And the dangerous thing about ambiguity is, it's everywhere.
Social.
Level 2 is where fears become human, influenced by our interactions with other people. And what I find surprising about that is, nothing illustrates this better than a 500 million-year-old reflex rooted in contamination cues, or, in other words, the fear of pathogens, which actually comes from the disgust system, a sister of fear, but didn't fully mature until humans started living in groups. When we did, working together changed everything, but perhaps most quietly by opening a new dimension to fear, internal threats, which are invisible to the naked eye but just as deadly as anything else. So while darkness made us afraid of what might be out there, pathogens took that same ambiguity and turned it inside, which is way worse, because unlike predators, pathogens don't announce themselves. They're delayed in onset, silent, and most dangerously, spread in accordance with the very thing that made humans successful, the size of our groups. And there are some terrifying examples of this across history. The Black Death, in just a few years, killed roughly 50% of Europe's population. The Justinian plague of Constantinople killed so many people that bodies had to be piled in the streets or dumped into the ocean. But the most interesting thing, to me, is the after effects. The fear of pathogens can't possibly just be chalked up to the fact that they're lethal, because at a deeper level, they're transformative. Every pandemic in the history of humanity created immense changes that spread much farther than the death toll. They changed our psychology, our behavior, who we eat with or who we trust. They changed economies, the level of superstition, and the amount of control. In fact, in Rome's case, the Justinian plague is thought to be one of the leading theories behind why its empire collapsed. All of these are a function of pathogens targeting the places that should be the safest. Us. Except, they were never the safest, were they? Because you know what's more terrifying than something that's invisible? Something that can hide its intentions, and worse, is just as clever as you are. The craziest thing I found when I was trying to map these different fears is this, the International Affective Picture System, which is a mouthful. But if you look closely, there's one fear that consistently generates more negative emotion than almost anything else. It's not pollution, not disease, and not predators. It's humans. Specifically, angry humans. And it's for good reason. Humans can undoubtedly be more compassionate than anything that has ever existed. However, we also have that same capacity towards violence. And this capacity isn't exactly a recent phenomenon. 10,000 years ago, a group of hunter-gatherers were, for lack of a better word, massacred, and it wasn't exactly merciful. In a sample of Paleolithic fossils, 26% had some form of cranial trauma, most of which were male. And in two modern hunter-gatherer societies, roughly 40% of all deaths come from other humans. Regardless of the conditions, humans can be, and often are, a threat. But humans fighting each other is one thing. What can truly make humans terrifying is that they're you. They know what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, how to best inflict pain, and perhaps worst of all, how to build tools that do it better. Something that, despite being documented in other animals for hunting purposes, hasn't popped up in any other species. Still, to imply that the fear of angry humans only comes from violence is, in my opinion, false. Because while that's definitely part of it, violence is, at least partially, a product of something deeper. After I found the affective picture system, the first thing I did is start tearing through mythology. Because, what are ancient stories if not an artifact of human psychology? And what I found is that violence is quite prevalent, but every time it's mentioned, there's another theme right there with it that I think is even more important: belonging. In the Romulus and Remus story, the brotherly conflict stems from who has the right to belong as the founder of Rome. When arguing about the city walls, Romulus kills Remus, which literally marks the line between who belongs in the city and who doesn't. In the story of Cain and Abel, God accepts Abel's offer but rejects Cain's. Infuriated by this, Cain kills Abel, and for those actions is punished by being banished, or in other words, by not belonging. But while this thread is intimately tied to these stories of violence, it's also everywhere else. In medieval Europe, punishments of shame were literally designed to weaponize this mechanism. In Imperial China, punishment was enforced through the konge, a massive wooden collar that had to be worn in public. In neuroscience, social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain, which has also been documented in primates. It's why they groom, thought to be why we blush, part of why fear is socially contagious, and of course, perfectly aligns with everything we know about evolutionary biology. All of these, at least to me, highlight what the biggest fear of humans towards other humans actually is: the need to belong, which as a category is made up of the fear of rejection, humiliation, disapproval, and looking foolish. I mean, what other explanation could there possibly be for why people fear public speaking of all things more than death?
Mind fears.
An interesting experience that exemplifies what level 3 is about is what I like to call place-based anxiety, which has been documented all across the world. Essentially, people, for no apparent reason, experience a sudden wave of dread in one specific location. Sometimes it's a room in a relative's house, other times a hallway in an office building. Regardless, every time they step into it, a sudden wave of fear hits them. What's strange is that nothing about the place seems out of the ordinary. There's no creepy backstory, no hidden threat, it's perfectly fine. And yet, every single time, without fail, the feeling hits out of nowhere. Most people think it comes from low-frequency sound, which our nervous system picks up on and then interprets as a threat. But this kind of fear, the kind that's not dangerous yet feels as though it is surprisingly common. Submerged man-made objects, for example, are not something most people will encounter in their lifetime. There's also nothing inherently dangerous about them. But a rusting chain, disappearing into the abyss below, so far you can't tell where it ends, can instantly send a shiver down your spine. Same thing with buildings that are way too large, spaces that are way too tight, needles, weird patterns, and basically anything else. There is only one reason I can think of for why fears like this can exist, and it's called recursion. So far in its evolution, we've seen how fear changed from a physical reaction to an emotional one, largely because as we grew more complex, so did our environments. As our environments grew more complex, so did the types of threats we would face. But when it comes to recursion, the ability to think about thinking, we don't even know how it evolved. Theories range from language being the origin, to violence being its precursor, all the way to it stemming from how the brain processes things. Regardless, the ability to nest thoughts was possibly more impactful on us than anything ever. Because, well, it's what allows us to create, to plan, to worry about the future and imagine hypotheticals. But as great as that is, it also leaves us vulnerable to systems like fear. And once fear enters a nested loop of thinking, it doesn't need an actual threat. It becomes self-sustaining, a loop that can grow and feed inside your imagination. This is where catastrophizing comes from, where panic attacks come from, where phobias or the feeling of something being haunted comes from. But what's crazy is that it's also where the enjoyment of fear comes from, allowing us to experience fear without being in any real danger. So while being the creator of abstract fears, it also changed the nature of fear, which is important because it means fear is getting stronger. And it's getting stronger because it doesn't need you.
Society.
Up until this point, we focused on how fear shaped us, which was necessary because for most of human history, it was shaping us. But the thing about humans is, we can influence things too, and when we do, that new version can influence us back. This is the essence of memetics, and fear is no exception. So when humans started creating things, we started influencing fear, shaping it in the ways that were most beneficial to us. However, in doing so, we also made fear self-replicating, something that doesn't need people, can spread between them, and can last generations. As far as I know, two reoccurring narratives capture this perfectly: the endless quest and the temptation of forbidden knowledge. In the first one, stories like Sisyphus or the Flying Dutchman are essentially fears about unavoidable situations. In them, a defined individual cheats fate, gets punished, and then ends up suffering eternally. The original fear that inspired this theme was probably some form of helplessness, but after changing through generations of countless retellings, it spread into other areas, shaping morality, how we understand things, persevere, and so much more. In the second pattern, stories like Pandora's Box or The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter likely stems from a fear of what isn't immediately visible, rooted in our fear of darkness. In them, there's something forbidden, curiosity tempts someone into interacting with it, and their interaction triggers consequences. Over generations, we turn that fear, the fear rooted in darkness, into a fear of human progress, which even now continues to grow, shape, and be shaped by us. So to answer the question, fear is getting stronger, and it will always get stronger, because as we change, it does too. Thanks for watching.